All right, everybody. So welcome. It's a beautiful Friday, and we are recording another episode of the MILPA Show. And today we have some special guests on the episode. We are doing a Pride Month, LGBTQI plus, just wanting to jump into conversation. We try not to have this conversation is year round, right? It's not just during Pride Month. But we do want to highlight the fact that, there's people in our community, and of course, like even in our own indigenous culture, that identify as queer, LGBTIQ, two-spirit. And so we're welcoming all of you, sending you some love. Hopefully you're doing well. My name is Rosara Figueroa Mendoza. I'm the communications coordinator at MILPA. And my preferred gender pronoun is she, her. And and I will go ahead and pass it on to Kaylin, who is our media intern.
Hello, everyone. It's nice to see y'all coming back. So yes, my name is Kaylin Figueroa. I use she, her, ella pronouns. And I'm really glad to see all of y'all here. I'll go ahead and pass it on to Des.
Thanks. Hey, everyone. Desiree here, also known as Des. I use the she, her pronouns. And today we have with us our special guests, Mariluz and Bobbie Joe, which I'll go ahead and let them introduce themselves. So whoever wants to go, whether it's Mariluz, Bobbie Joe, y'all want to introduce yourselves?
So hello, everyone. My name is Bobbie Joe Garcia. Bobbie Joe is my first name, but feel free to just call me Bobbie. And what should I share about myself? I'm a community member from Greenfield. My family has lived here for like over 80 years, and I still continue to live here because I genuinely I like Greenfield and I care about Greenfield. And I like to organize with the community here to make our conditions and our community better. And I recently graduated from UC Santa Cruz this last spring. I don't want to talk about it right now, but maybe in the future that could be like a future MILPA episode or something, talking about being a college student. But yeah, that was really hard, and having to do my last year in the pandemic really sucked, and I'm just really happy to have it be over and to be able to do opportunities like this and kind of like reconnect with folks at MILPA, but also folks just in the wider like Monterey County, what would you call it, like organizing sphere, all of the people included in that, which is also all of y'all. So appreciate y'all for having us here. And now to my best homie, Mariluz, and partner in crime.
What's up, y'all? So my name is Mariluz, or Mari. I use they, them pronouns. And I'm born and raised in East Salinas, California, more specifically the neighborhood of Acosta Plaza. #rep. Including the hashtag, just because I know this will be in social media, but maybe that's a little cringe. I am also a college student. I attend Yale University. I'll be a junior in the fall. After taking a leave during this pandemic, unlike Bobbie Joe, I decided not to do online classes. I thought it was too much. But fortunately, during this time, I was able to, continue engaging with my community. I'm also very involved with, being an organization with my community and ensuring that I can contribute and advocate for my community in the way that is most appropriate for me to do. So I guess like at this point, I consider myself to be like, in organization with my community, but I've also grown into, the identity of being a scholar. This summer, I'll be conducting research actually with MILPA on the Telpochcali Leadership Academy, which I'm very excited about. And maybe that can be a future MILPA show episode where we talk about the research, because it's going to be fun, and it's been quite a lot to build up to it, but I'm so looking forward.
Yeah, gracias everybody for checking in. Thank you, Mariluz and Bobbie Joe, for being here. And so with that, we're gonna get started with a little check-in question. So the summer solstice is gonna be this Sunday, June 20th. And so what are you looking forward to for summer? If you have something in particular that you look forward to during the summertime, feel free to take it away, Bobbie Joe.
I guess for me, in this time of like, after having a completely like weird summer last year, like I'm still expecting the summer to be weird and maybe like, crappy things to take place and big events in the world that we can't control to happen. But like, honestly, I'm just looking forward to like just being able to meet like my 3 friends who are vaccinated. Like I honestly don't like, I'm not really big on the idea of like going straight back to like concerts or going straight back to all these events. If other people feel comfortable doing that, like that's on them. But for me, I'm more like still processing, this whole year that we've been through, going on like a year and like some change now. So yeah, I'm just like, now that we're all done with school and people aren't like as busy as they were during the official like school year, I'm just looking forward to like, oh, like let's come hang out like in my backyard or like let's go on a drive like, through the back roads or something, or let's go pick up Mariluz and get like some boba or something. Like just really simple like little things that I wasn't able to do or enjoy throughout like this whole last year. So I miss those little things, and that's what I'm really looking forward to being able to have in this summer. I can pass it to Desiree.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, Bobbie Jo. You're from Greenfield. I'm currently living in Soledad. We're South County people, so those drives in the back roads, man, those are where it's at. I'm also kind of person, I have an off-road vehicle, so I like to go off-roading. I think that's one of like my biggest things that I'm looking forward to, is being able to have more opportunity to do that. But I think in general, summer has its own like vibe to it. It's like you could almost just like smell the barbecue in the air, or like the sunscreen, like everybody's going swimming somehow, one way or the other, getting some like water activities going. So I think that just whole vibe of summer is what I'm looking forward to. And yes, it's going to be a little bit weird due to COVID. So like getting back to like being able to do those kind of things with other people. But once we do hopefully get some sort of flow going, we can get that going, it could become semi-normal. But yeah, I think that's what I'm looking forward to. And I'll go ahead and pass it to Mariluz.
What's up, y'all? So honestly, exact same thing as Bobbie Jo. LOL, I just want to hang out with my friends. Also just trying to, make the most of the summer, because after being at home for a year, I'm kind of getting those feels of, damn, maybe I don't want to go back to Connecticut again. Or it's not that I don't want to go back. It's more of like, it feels like I'm moving there again for the first time. Just because I'm not used to living there, or like it's been a while since I've been there. So trying to, process what all that means for me. And obviously like what I come to is, hey, like enjoy the time that you have here while you have it, which is the summer. And hopefully we can have some good experiences while, still being safe. I'm happy to be fully vaccinated. Y'all, if you're watching this and you're not fully vaccinated, you should also go get your vaccine. They're free. Walk-in appointments at Walgreens. Yeah, it's gonna be a good time.
So what I'm looking forward to this summer, honestly, ever since I was little, me and my siblings would get together and watch Shark Week, and we would just like make a whole event out of it. We would like just like sit down, watch all the episodes, and then there was a couple of years where they just didn't run it or wasn't any new episodes, and we were just like stuck there, like, so what do we do now? So I'm definitely looking forward to that. I know last summer I watched it with my roommate. Because it was the first time that I had like finally moved away from my home. So this summer, I don't know what's gonna happen, but definitely looking forward to seeing just like how much they progressed or what they found for like new sharks. I know the other day I went to Santa Cruz and I was out there and like, wow, like there was a shark attack here a couple of years ago. So it's just crazy, just like knowing that information that's like not really relevant to my day-to-day, but it's cool. So I'm definitely looking forward to that, and happy to hear from all of y'all. So I'll go ahead and pass it back to you, Rosaura.
Yeah, summertime is here. It's honestly my favorite season of the year. And I've already been to Bakersfield, and Bakersfield has great memories because my brother and I would go there every summer. So going back to Bakersfield just kind of makes me feel like a kid again. And so looking forward to just continuing trips to Bakersfield to see my family. And the pool opened finally at my place. So we got in yesterday, my roommate and I, and it was just nice to just be floating around and just relieving anxiety. It's a great workout. And so I feel like I slept really well for the first time in a really long time, actually, because I was able to just kind of do that full body workout and just hang out. And I think beyond that, just looking forward to beach day. So, you know, we're talking about like doing a beach day for the MILPA folks, all the people that have been part of the coalition work, because we deserve it. Like, Jesus, we've been doing so much work. And even folks that haven't been necessarily a part of that, it's just a celebration for all of us, right? We've all been doing work in one way or another. And we need to be able to stop and just kind of enjoy each other's presence and build those memories, because that's what's gonna hopefully sustain us when we're having a tough time. It's like, oh my God, I remember during the summer, we had this experience, we built this memory. So I look forward to being able to just create those memories with folks. And I think beyond that, just honestly, like what you said, Bobbie Jo, is just like, hey, let's go hit up the store to get chips, or let's go walking over here. Or like, I love that feeling of just like, you don't have anything to do, so you can just hit up your friend and just like, hey, like, let's go to the mall real quick and do this or that. So I love that feeling. But thank y'all for sharing, and thank you for being here. And so we're gonna get it started with a little, y'all shared a little bit more about who you are, but feel free to take your space and time to tell us, you know, who you are, tell us a little bit more about who you are, but then also, what does Pride Month mean to you, if it has any particular significance, or generally just any type of feeling that you would want to share around that. So feel free to take it away, Bobbie Jo, and then you could popcorn to Mariluz.
For sure, thank you for the question. So I guess to say a little bit more about who I am and why I was invited to the like MILPA Pride, like MILPA Show Pride episode. I do identify as queer, a queer person of color living in Greenfield. We do exist. we're just like, you know, more low key down here, I think. And I guess for me, like Pride it's interesting because for a lot of my youth, like I didn't really, like I knew that Pride was like a thing. The way I thought of it was like, oh, it's like an event that happens in like big cities, and at the time I only like understood like a binary of like sexuality. So I thought like, okay, there's only like straight people and there's only like gay people. And Pride is like where basically all the gay people go to like have a good time in like the street, and it looks like a big old party. And that's what like I understood from it. And I thought that was cool. Like I didn't have a sense of like I wasn't really raised Catholic. So for a lot of people in my community, there's usually like an inherent like sense of like, oh, that's bad. And for me, I was just like, oh, that looks like hella fun. Like, Mom, can we go? And my mom was always kind of like, let's wait till you get a little older. You know, it's not exactly like a kid space. And that was like my understanding for a really long time. And I just think that's so like funny now, because I feel like that's my understanding of Pride as just a party in the city is like, so like, that's not what Pride is at all, from what I've like actually grown to learn about, like, when did this event like start? Where does it come from? What are its roots in? And its roots are in basically queer people back in like the 60s and 70s, like defending themselves against, you know, state oppression, usually through the police departments in the cities that they lived in. So like now my perception of Pride is like, so I feel like I'm so much more, I guess, connected to it, because even when I was younger, like Pride and even like gayness and queerness, it seemed like a white thing. Like that's not something that's like within my community. Like there's no parties happening, there's nobody celebrating this, there's nobody even out. Like maybe that's just not for my community. And learning that the origins of Pride are in like Black and brown trans women fighting the police, you know, that really can shift like, oh wait, like maybe that is something that I can be a part of, and that runs deeper than just like flying a rainbow flag. Like I think that's kind of what Pride feels like it's become, is just like, oh look, we put up our flag for a month and that's kind of like it. All of the companies change their logos to like the rainbow logo, but never really do anything to actually like uplift queer people, to ensure that their needs are being met, to address all of these like disparities that queer people face. So I feel like it's almost like having to like restructure like an understanding of Pride for myself, because what you're kind of fed through the media, I feel like isn't really what pride is about. Like pride is about being, you know, prideful in who you are and being open about who you are, but I also think it's about being like angry and being organized and building community with people and really trying to point out like the world is not made for us. How do we get us there? How do we protect ourselves and push and resist like these systems that oppress us? And I think that kind of gets lost in like the corporate really happy rainbow, like everything's good, you know, everything's a party. Like not everything is a party, but we do need a party. Like Rosada mentioned earlier, like there needs to be the parties to sustain us through the hard times. But I don't think it should be forgotten, like the roots of this event and the roots of like this whole, you know, community and everything. Yeah, I think I've gone on for a minute. So Mariluz, why don't you you come on with you know, how what your feelings are about this. Like we've had some conversations, but I am really interested to know how you also interpret Pride Month as well.
Yeah, so I do feel very similarly, I guess, to give a little bit of my background. So I am also queer. I'm from East Salinas, from a brown neighborhood, obviously. I knew I was queer, like when I was very young. So I didn't really know what pride was when like I found my identity. So that's somewhere where our stories differ, right? I like didn't have this conception of pride like the way that I was exposed to like, you know, sexualities or gender outside of the binary was just like through my friends because I was that kid in middle school and high school whose friends were all just queer, which was probably a good thing, you know. I'm very thankful for that. But obviously, like as I grew older, I did see, you know, like Pride celebration. Oh my God, San Francisco. And I didn't really think much about it. It was just like, oh, it's just somewhere where people go and like they take photos and they post them on social media. Or, you know, something that like influencers would do is that like if they were a YouTuber that was big on like being queer, they would always go to Pride and be like, oh my gosh, I'm so queer, look at me at Pride. And I'd be like, oh yeah, well, like they're that YouTuber that like always emphasizes that they're queer, so obviously they're gonna be at Pride. Like there's so many like 2010s YouTubers that fit into that box. Just think about your favorite and put them in there. Like that's what I would see on social media when I was like, I don't know, 12, 13. So yeah, like obviously now and I have a conception of pride that is very similar to Bobbie Jo's, in that I understand like the origins of pride, the origins of like demonstration, the history of like queer and trans politics, especially like, you know, politics of people of color. And I see pride and like the celebration of pride, the origins of pride as something that is inherently anti-colonial, anti-capitalist, and anti-police. And actually, like very recently, the Salinas City Council decided to raise the rainbow flag and, you know, make a photo op and post it on social media. And when they were having the budget hearings, this is actually what I made my public comment about. Like the fact that they were being so ignorant about the origins of, you know, queer liberation, like the narratives of queer liberation that still exist to this day, but you know, without doing anything material about it. And that's something that's really unfortunate, that in communities like, you know, Salinas, and communities like, you know, throughout the whole Monterey County that are predominantly, you know, brown and Black, we don't have a lot of supports for queer people. And it's very difficult, right? You could track the root of, you know, not having a lot of supports to different things. It's an intermingle of like, you know, just the fact that like institutionally queer people always struggle to have, you know, tangible like community supports and community programming regardless of, you know, where you're at. But also the fact that like, you know, a lot of it is composed of like religious, like traditional immigrant folks who are not open to those things, and you know, have not really explored like life outside of the binary, or like maybe if they have explored it, have tried to repress it, because that's something that happens a lot to our family, right? So maybe like you've heard your family member like say something very suspicious or like act very defensive about homophobia. They're probably in the closet. Like, I'm sorry, but they're probably in the closet. I'm just gonna put it there. So yeah, like a combination of institutionally queer people, we don't really have supports, like regardless of where we're at. Like our community, the composition of our community, like the fact that like due to all these factors, queer people are less likely to feel comfortable, you know, being public about their identity. And like obviously that's a barrier to organizing and to making our voices heard and to advocating for ourselves, to developing, you know, these systems, these places, these centers for, you know, our support. So this is also what pride means to me, right? Like being comfortable being who you are and being comfortable expressing that. And even though I don't believe in coming out, I don't think we should assume that someone is like cisgender or heterosexual ever. And I will never come out in the way that is traditionally expected. I think that there's something very special in celebrating your identity, regardless of who you are. And when it comes to identities that have been historically marginalized, like queerness, this is something that's very special to do. And pride's really a space where like we can emphasize all these things that like mean so much to me and put them out there and like, you know, be who we genuinely are and fight for the causes that we care about. So I've also gone for on for a bit now, so I think that'll be the end of my response.
I love that. Thank y'all so much for sharing. And I'm going to invite Des and Caitlin to jump in if y'all have any thoughts, reflections, questions that cropped up, anything that you yourself would want to share based on the question or anything that Bobbie Jo or Mariluz said. I will say that for myself, yeah, there's a lot of like what was mentioned of repression, of holding yourself in, of not being able, like maybe our families, right? I know that during the presentation that came up as well, that a lot of time Catholicism itself emphasizes that it's a sin to be anything other than straight, and to always being kind of pressured to like, you have to find that man that you're going to have the children with and the house and all of that. And so there never is any space to be queer, right? And so I remember like when I was a kid hearing like my cousin, I was just thinking about this today, like, you know, calling my brother queer, and that was like a form of, I'm gonna kind of like make fun of you or whatever. And so it's interesting that our family, I don't think they I don't know, they are who they are, but sometimes it can be hurtful, right? And so being a queer woman myself, I know it was a whole, you know, journey of feeling comfortable to even say that, right? Because in middle school, just kind of going through a traumatic experience and just kind of like, oh shit, okay, well, I'm gonna hide myself for 13 years because that's not gonna happen again. That was humiliating, right? And so I just appreciate the space for you. And even what you said, Mariluz, that like the coming out, like that's a lot of pressure too. Like straight people don't have to come out, straight people just are, right? And they're accepted, it seems, automatically into society without having to do anything other than just be who they are, right? And so I feel that for sure, and not, you know, feeling that pressure of like, okay, I'm gonna do this whole thing, I'm just gonna instead just continue being who I am. So just, I appreciate y'all in this conversation. I'm excited to hear more from y'all. Like that got me really pumped up, but I want to open up the floor for
Definitely. I feel like that it's a huge spectrum as it is, like with gender, sexuality and all of that. But I know there's a conversation that I've had with my friends. It's like, if there's even a movie of like straight people coming out and being like, coming out to their families being like, well, I'm straight now. And it's like, well, isn't it easier to just have people part of the LGBTQ just not come out to folks? It's just like, okay, just if they do come, like, hey, this is my significant other, like take it as it is, you know, you don't have to make it a whole, like, you can, and it's up to you what you want to do, if you want to have like this whole extravagant thing or just coming out like bringing the cake to your family, because it's like definitely your own identity and how you feel. But at the same time, if like you bring someone home and just like, well, this is my partner, and like people are just like, okay, cool, move on with it, because obviously like I didn't want to make it a big deal, so why do you have to make it a big deal as well? So definitely like voicing what y'all said, because it's important to have these conversations with folks, even if it's just like a day-to-day, or like maybe it's just something that like it's bypassing through the time, but definitely very, very important.
Awesome. Thanks, y'all, everybody, for sharing. And I know that, well, yeah, just thank y'all for sharing. Thank y'all for being vulnerable. Thank y'all for being yourselves. I know that there could be a lot of people, even our viewers of the MILPA show, that could really relate to y'all's lives or the sentiments that y'all brought up. So just really appreciating y'all for that. But with that being said, I'd like to pose a question to y'all. So I know that recently y'all did a presentation for us at MILPA. I believe it was called Decolonizing the Binary, which I really appreciated very much and learned a lot from. So thank you guys for that. But so would you like to tell us a little bit more about what motivated you to hold that space for us there?
Okay, because this isn't like the first even like event that we or presentation that we gave, workshop thing for MILPA. Like the first one we did, I think, was before Desiree, Kaylin, or Rosada, like before any of y'all were like on the team yet. And what was that, like 2019? And I feel like our intention at that time was like, me and Mariluz had gone through, like we both started at MILPA like at the same time. We stayed on with MILPA at the same time and like kept, you know, being interns. And I think in our time together and like where we were at too in our own like educations and our own like knowledge on different like subjects regarding social justice, which also included like issues regarding LGBT people, a community that we were like both part of, it kind of was like, okay, as much as we love MILPA, there is like a lack of knowledge here about this issue. There's a lack of understanding. What can we do to like address that? Like this place is all about learning from each other, learning like how to decolonize, move, like becoming, you know, these like newer, or I guess more developed, more grown like versions of ourselves. And in our time in like the programs that we were in as youth, I think it was like apparent, like as much as we love like OG MILPA people, a lot of them are formerly incarcerated men, and they don't necessarily get the same, they don't have the experiences, I think, that were like conducive to having these kinds of conversations. So like even when we'd bring stuff up or be like, hey, you kind of said, I love Edgar, but I'd always tag Edgar on stuff like, hey bro, like what do you mean by that? And like really having like these, you know, I wouldn't call them arguments, but just like having conversations and being able to really get uncomfortable and like almost maybe reach that point where we're having an argument, but like at the end it's like, dude, but this is, you know, this is about like love. This is about I want to teach you something because you're a great facilitator. I love the work that you do with people, but you work with a lot of people and you don't know who's going to be in your group, and you should be a little more like on game with certain things. And that, I'm just picking on Edgar because he can handle it. But like that wasn't just a conversation with like him, you know, that was a conversation with a few people at MILPA. So the first time around, it was very much like, okay, well, if we know, like, how can we share this knowledge? How can we put it out there? What can we create? And I think not only was that a really cool like thing for our like presentation skills and our organizing skills and our facilitation, but just like it felt good to kind of like be welcomed with like open arms. Like, yeah, we want to learn from you. We want to give you like the hours necessary to put on this workshop, to have this space. And thinking back to that first workshop, like just where I'm at now, like, you know, 2 years later, I'm so much better at facilitating spaces and organizing them, but I still really appreciate like the openness that people from MILPA like walked into the space with, and the willingness to learn and to be wrong and to make mistakes and to kind of like consider like what they've been, how they've talked and how they've maybe referred to people, like, etc. And I think this time around, that same kind of like sentiment of like, okay, MILPA has expanded, MILPA is bigger. If anything, these conversations are even more important now because of how many more people MILPA reaches. How do we ensure that this place is like a safe space for queer people to exist in as well? Because the work that MILPA does regarding ending mass incarceration, ending the school to prison pipeline, building people power, like queer people fit into that equation everywhere. Like obviously like me and Mariluz are here, and Rosada, right, and other queer people in the movement and in the struggle. So we really just wanted to show like this isn't an issue that exists like away from us. This isn't like a separate thing over here. Like we do our business, maybe we hook up and we like sometimes collaborate, but like queerness isn't really a thing. Like we wanted to show like, no, like there are people within this organization who maybe you don't even know about yet, which is fine because that's their own personal identity. Like that might be a part of this community. And how do we ensure that this is a space not only for community members, but the people that work here, where everyone can like have a part, everyone can feel welcomed, everyone can feel like this is a place where I can do meaningful work, regardless of whatever sexuality, your gender identity, your sex, like I will be able to do work here. This is like a space that I am welcome. So I think that's like what I really wanted to put, because I felt like as a queer person myself, who only like had barely found out, I was figured out for myself that I was queer, like right before I got to MILPA. I felt like, well, this place made me feel welcome. Like this place made me feel so much, like I grew so much, like I want to make this a space that other people can come into as well. So yeah. Anything you want to add, Mariluz?
Yeah. So obviously something that's very important is like ensuring that folks are aware of, you know, the various communities, the various identities that people hold in the spaces that we inhabit. Because, you know, we think about, oh, Monterey County, Milpa, Black and brown people, yay! Oh, wait, why are you assuming that all the Black and brown people are cisgender and heterosexual? Why are you assuming that they're all able-bodied? Why are you assuming like all of these different things, right, that we don't take into account when we organize? And obviously, like our organizing approaches here in Salinas and at Milpa are, you know, relatively inclusive. They're relatively informed of the needs of the community, but oftentimes they still fall short of including queer and disabled folks. And this is not something that is just an issue in Salinas or in Milpa. It's something that, you know, happens everywhere. And lately I've seen, you know, more people try to bring awareness towards these issues or like these people, these communities in their own organizing spaces. But we have to recognize that this isn't something that is new, you know, like it's not something that's just happening now. Like obviously now with like, you know, the rise of social media, like information happening rapidly, like we can have access to this information like very quickly, and it's something that's more accessible. But there is like writings, there's records, there's history of like movements, like, you know, years ago in the past of like, you know, folks from generations behind us in the movement who have expressed these same sentiments of, oh, this space I was in wasn't really aware of the fact that like I was queer. This space I was in wasn't really like aware of the fact that I'm disabled, and like they didn't really make me feel comfortable. And that's, you know, similar to how like in the history of organizing, oftentimes we see like movements be co-opted by men who end up like in a cycle of patriarchy that excludes women. It's the exact same thing for queer folks and disabled folks. We end up in a space of like cis heteronormativity, or we end up in a space where like, you know, we normalize that everyone should be able-bodied. Like we don't emphasize accessibility, and we don't emphasize like, you know, neurodivergence even. And I think that obviously like these are very big issues to tackle, and right now we're talking about one very specific thing, which is queerness. I think that like when we talk about queerness, we should look at it with this lens, right? This is an approach that has been historically ignored in organizing. Like this is a community that has been historically ignored when we develop our approaches towards looking at the world, towards looking at colonization, towards looking at like, you know, capitalism, towards looking at the systems that exist. And it's always more than just racial. It's always more than just like, you know, your incarceration status. It's always more than like, other systems that you've been involved with that like, impact how you exist in this capitalist like colonial society. It can also include things like queerness. It can also include things like, disability. And I think it's important to really emphasize that, because there's so many things that, make a person who they are. And there's so many communities out there that exist that have, advocated for themselves when no one has been there to help them advocate for what they need. And the queer community is like an example of one of these communities that is very large, but still continues to be ignored, and continues to be like misread, or continues to be like talked over, especially now as queerness has become mainstream. It has become trendy, as like corporations now see queerness as cool and can put like, rainbows on everything and try to sell you something. It's even more important to have these conversations and to talk about how does queerness actually function in a colonial capitalist society, and what does that mean? Because I think capitalism is great at co-opting things and identities that mean a lot to us, like for example, like girl boss co-opting like misogyny and the experiences of women under misogyny, or like, oh my god, like I am a brown small business owner, I'm going to take the world, co-opting like racial histories and co-opting what it means to be like a person of color, or rainbow flag on everything, co-opting what it means to be queer and making it something to make money out of. So we have to be really critical of what all these things mean, and make sure to hear the voices of like those people that are around us, right? As with any other community, but especially with the queer community, right? Like sit down, listen to your queer folks, listen to your queer friends, like make an effort to learn about these histories. Even if you are cisgender and heterosexual, you can still learn something about it, especially if you're in the movement. Like read from like queer organizers, like read about the movements of the past, like even start by reading about Stonewall if you want. Like it's a very popular one, just check it out, see what it was actually like, see what it was actually about. Anti-police riot, and try to get something from that, and you'll see that everything is interlinked. Like there's so many things that come together towards like a single struggle for liberation, but we don't often look at it like that, unfortunately, because our society benefits from stratification. It benefits from ensuring that our communities can't come together. It benefits from not understanding each other. So we have to make that effort to understand each other. And, I feel like this was very complicated. So if there's any clarifications that y'all want to ask, please feel free to ask. Otherwise, that's what I have to say on that.
Yeah, thank you so much. And if I may jump in, so something that you were saying about the co-opting, right? I remember listening to this deodorant commercial, and it's like, put on this deodorant so you can be ready to go to the protest and start your business. And I'm like, you're selling directly to me. What the fuck? Like, how do you know these things, right? But it's just interesting how, yeah, they like capitalism. That's its job, right? It figures out exactly what we want, what we need, so that they can make profit off of it, even if they don't necessarily care what it means to be queer. And thank you for bringing to the forefront, not even to the forefront, but just people that have disabilities. And it made me think about the diversity wheel and how like we do need to consider the different identities, like people's body shape, age, religion, sexuality, gender, immigration, race, and even beyond that, like ability and just all the different ways that make a person. We just can't assume that obviously everyone's the same. So just thank you. But if I can just ask you to expand a little bit more on neurodivergence, I feel like it's the second time I've heard it. And it was probably you or Bobbie Jo that said it the first time. And obviously I want to research more on it, but if you can dive a little bit more about that, if you'd like to.
Yeah, so this is in the context of how we talk about disability and how we define disability. Oftentimes, like there's something called invisible disabilities, and some invisible disabilities can be physical, right? For example, like you feel pain, but other people can't see your pain, or like other people can't tell that you're in pain. That's an invisible disability. But some people who are neurodivergent, meaning that like, they have a diagnosis or they have an experience of mental health or something having to do with the way that they perceive the world that is different from what our society says is the norm, they might also consider that a disability for themselves. So for example, like, people on the autism spectrum can consider themselves to be neurodivergent. People who, have like BPD can consider themselves to be divergent. People who have OCD can consider themselves to be neurodivergent. But it's something that's very personal, right? You can't really tell someone, oh, you're neurodivergent. It is really what it means to you, because the conversation of, oh, what is like neurotypical, what is neurodivergent, is very difficult, because obviously like everyone experiences the world in a different way, and like psychology has a history of being very racist and classist. So we can dive into that later, and it's something that I personally have to do more research on as well. But this is how like I see, neurodivergence as an identity function, and something to explore. And this is obviously, like I said, in the context of like, disability awareness and like identities of disability within organizing, which can be interlinked with queerness, because obviously like you can be queer and disabled, just like you can be queer and a person of color, or you could be all of them. We can hold so many identities. There's really no limit.
Wow. Thank you so much. Y'all are so badass. I mean, I'm just sitting here listening to y'all, and I mean, just expanding on your presentation, like, wow, this conversation, I'm learning a lot, y'all. So I appreciate y'all. Yes. Oh, wow. So I just wanted to thank you for being pioneers for the queer people in the MILPA space, because like y'all had mentioned before that, this wasn't something that was typically talked about. So just thank y'all so much for being those people and advocating for folks in that way. And I know that there was some other topics within that presentation as well that brought up a lot of different kinds of questions for myself and for others. And I think one of those questions that I heard of was, what pronouns should we use for non-binary people? So I don't know who wants to hop on that question.
I was gonna say maybe oh yeah, maybe like we can split that up, because I feel like to answer this question, we should first say like, well, what is being non-binary, before we like jump into what pronouns do you use. So Mariluz, do you want to maybe start that conversation, or do you want me to start that conversation? Because I know what it means to me, but I feel a little nervous about trying to explain it in like a broader way.
What if we both answer it?
Okay.
How about that?
But can you go first?
Okay, cool. I thought you were gonna go first. So what does it mean to be non-binary? Oh my gosh, this is a very broad question. And like Bobbie just said, the reason why it's difficult to define it in a very broad sense is because it's something that's very individual. A non-binary identity is an umbrella term. So under the non-binary umbrella, there's different identities that one can have if you really want to break it down. So for example, you can be like bi-gender, which means like, oh, you believe you hold two gender identities at once, and be non-binary because that's outside of the binary. You can be agender, meaning that you have no gender, and be non-binary because that's outside of the gender binary. The gender binary being like man and woman. You can also be gender fluid and be non-binary, like literally endless identities, like whatever label you want to put on yourself, whatever definition you want to put on yourself that is outside of man and woman, then you can also consider yourself to be non-binary. And emphasizing like consider yourself, because there can be situations in which someone can say, oh, I consider myself to be gender fluid, but I don't really feel comfortable with non-binary because it doesn't like accurately represent who I am. And that's okay, right? These are all names. Like, these are all labels. And they're really, arbitrary when you look at this at a broader picture, right? Gender queerness, which is even like a larger label than non-binary, is very broad. And it really means different things to different people. So when we talk about like what non-binary means to me, since I am someone that, considers myself to be non-binary, to me, it is a navigation within the gender binary. And this is because like under the non-binary umbrella, I consider myself to be gender fluid. So that would be like my sub-label under non-binary, at least the way I look at it, right? How the words that help define myself would be like non-binary and then gender fluid. And this is why, like, for me, a navigation within the binary is important, because that's how I see my fluidity within like man and woman, with my identity changing from day to day. Like some days I wake up and I'm like, wow, I really feel like I'm a man today. And like sometimes it can lead to like slight gender crises of like, oh my God, what if I'm actually like a trans man? Like, what the hell? And another day I'll wake up and I'll be like, oh my God, like I feel like a woman today. And like, then I'll realize, okay, maybe I'm not a trans man. And then I go like forward and back and like all the way around. But I recognize that this is just how my identity works, right? Like this relationship with the binary that I have is different than like, what a cisgendered person would like identify with, right? I don't see myself as only holding one space within the binary. I see myself as navigating within it, like from day to day, like holding different spaces in it. And I think that this is what really makes my identity what it is. And obviously, like not every non-binary person sees their identity within the binary, and some people might even see it outside of the binary. But what's really important is that like we have to consider the gender binary as something that exists, and as something that like non-binary folks such as myself have to unfortunately have a constant relationship with, right? Because this is the identity that is imposed on us, right? As soon as we're born, like we're something in the gender binary. And to be gender queer, we have to really like see, okay, what is my relationship with the gender binary? Like, do I see myself in it? Do I see myself out of it? Do I see myself in like something completely different? Like, how does this work? And that's where the individual factor comes in, because your relationship with like cis normativity, which means like the assumption that someone has to be a man or a woman, can be completely different based on your experiences, based on how you feel about yourself, like based on your expression, on so many factors. But at least like what I explained about a constant navigation within the binary is what it means to me. So I'd be really excited to now hear what non-binary means to Bobbie Jo.
Yeah, thanks for that, Mariluz. And I feel like in hearing you explain it, it was like a reminder of like, even though we both would fall under that umbrella term of non-binary, we both have very different conceptions of what it means for us. Like for myself, I feel like I didn't even identify as non-binary. Like I think I was like playing with the idea and like really starting to feel it out, like as I gained more friends who were non-binary, not because that means like I got turned into anything, but more just like experiencing and being around people who know who they are can really help you figure out, I think, who you are. And it kind of makes you feel safe because you see people exploring these identities in themselves, as we mentioned, within communities where these identities are not really uplifted and they're not valued and they're stressed. And I think like having people in my life who were like able to be themselves was very impactful. And then going into the pandemic, where I spent a lot of time in my house with myself, really gave me a lot of time to like reflect and think about my gender identity. Like I always told people, Like, I just figured out what my sexuality is, but I don't even want to think about my gender identity because that's like a Pandora's box. Like, I don't know what's going to come out. Like, I don't want to deal with it because that's going to be too much. And then the pandemic was like, well, here you go, like, deal with it. You're just by yourself, like, and these thoughts are coming up. So throughout that time, like, I guess for me, what I found out was, and it kind of reflects on like even like my the other parts of my life when I thought like, oh yeah, I'm just a woman, I'm just a girl. Like even that, like those things never really fit. I never felt like I fit into those boxes because of like the way I look, the way I was perceived by people. And even those titles, girl, woman, I think existing within like a patriarchal society, like I would just feel like those don't, like the way that people say it, like that doesn't fit who I am. There's like a specific picture that comes to mind, and I don't feel like I'm that picture. And I think for a long time I just like didn't know there was anything else. I just thought I was weird. Like I must just be weird because I'm thinking about these things about like myself that nobody else seems to be thinking about. I wasn't weird. There's actually quite a lot of people thinking about these things, but we just never talk about them, right? And so in the pandemic, I kind of found out for myself, like, I don't think I like am either a man or a woman. I don't know if those are like, and this is just Bobbie Jo, my personal opinion, you know, talking here. Like I don't know if those are actually real. Like obviously sex is real, like people, there are people of different sexes, but like the idea of what is a man and what is a woman, I guess for me is so tainted by like the society that we live in and the gender roles that if I sit down and I think about it too much, I'm like, what even are these things? And then like I garden a lot, I mess around with plants a lot, and there's like plants that have both sexes, both parts on one plant. There are plants that have like mushroom, some mushroom species have over like 500 genders. Like it's just like when you really think about how complex the world is, like how could there only be these two options for me that I clearly do not fit in? So that kind of like, and more conversations that are a little bit more personal also came up. And through that journey of really talking with myself and being uncomfortable and like thinking about memories, the past and stuff, I just came out like, you know, non-binary fits for me. I don't feel like I really have any other like like a sub, whatever you called it, Mariluz, like a subcategory. Because even those ones, like when I read them, like they don't really fit for me either. And I am okay with like not necessarily having like the perfect term to define who I am, because you couldn't define all of who I am in the term anyway. Like I'm Bobbie Jo, like that's the closest you're gonna get to defining me. So for me, like non-binary is like the identity that allows me to feel comfortable, because yeah, I don't really fit into the boxes that this world has. And I'm cool with that. Like I'll be chilling out here with my friends, you know, like none of us fit in those boxes anyway. And I think like, I feel like more people, if they were given the space to really consider who their identities are outside of like the expectations that are placed on them, as being like raised as women or being raised as men, like I feel like more people would maybe have experiences like mine or Mariluz's, where they really think about like, well, who am I? Because most of us are just told who we are. And it's really not until you are comfortable really facing yourself, looking in that mirror and like really looking at yourself and like, well, wait, is that who I am, or is this who somebody made me into? And for some of us, our life becomes a journey of how do I find out who I actually am? How do I look in this mirror and see somebody that is me, that feels like me? And that's the journey that I'm on right now, actually. And just to kind of like, I guess, give an example of what that journey could look like I have super long hair, as lots of people know. I've actually, if anybody knows, I'm trying to cut it, because I've never had short hair in my whole life, as a part of, again, being like a woman, and everyone saying like, oh, well, you know, like who's gonna want you, like who's gonna look at you, like all these things about having short hair, and you're gonna look like a man, you're gonna look like this. And like, what even does a man look like? Like Jesus had long hair. Like I'm gonna cut my hair I'm gonna cut it really short because I do want to have this like more, I guess, androgynous like look, because I've never been able to have that. I've always felt like I needed to have super long hair, like I needed to have a specific like feminine like silhouette with my hair and everything, and it's just like I don't need that anymore. So most of my pandemic was like working up the courage to really be like, you know what, I'm gonna fucking cut my hair because I can do that. Like it's okay. Like nothing's gonna happen. Nothing's gonna happen. I'm just gonna have short hair. I'm gonna be able to take shorter showers. I'm gonna use less shampoo. Like all of those good things. And I'm gonna feel more comfortable in who I am and be able to explore like this side of me that I hadn't previously unlocked before. So that's what being non-binary means to me. And in terms of what pronouns you should use, I would say you gotta ask the person, because some people use they them. Some people like myself, like I'm comfortable with she because I think it's just like it's what I've been used to my whole life, and it honestly doesn't really bother me too much to have like she be used. But I have been also adding they to my pronouns because I also like to not just be perceived as a she, and I like to have some like fluidity in that. So I only recently started like introducing myself as like Bobbie Joe, they, she, which has been kind of weird, but I've actually liked it. So yeah, it really, as we've explained here, and I hope portrayed here, like non-binary people can be very different and perceive themselves differently. So with anybody, it's you just have to ask, like, hey, what are your pronouns? Okay, cool. That's what I would do. If you don't know, just ask.
Yeah, and off of that, I feel like oftentimes like something that is also very rigid in the way that we look at it, and obviously due to the systems that exist, like cis heteronormativity, which we will talk more about later and define actually shortly right after this. We think that there is such thing as a man pronoun and a woman pronoun and a something else pronoun, right? The man pronoun being he, him, or like the woman pronoun being she, her, and the other pronoun, oh, just they, them, and that's it. But the thing that we have to keep in mind is that pronouns don't reflect gender. Although someone can, choose their pronouns in a way that is gender affirming, they do not always reflect the gender identity of that person. And the only way that you can really know what someone's gender identity is by talking with them or by them telling you, So for example, like there's women out there who might choose to use he, him pronouns, but that doesn't make them less of a woman. Like they're still a woman, or there might even be men who feel comfortable using she, her pronouns. Like think about drag queens, right? When they're in drag, they use she, her pronouns, but they might still be men. If they're cis men, they're men. They're just using she, her pronouns, but they're men. Or even like non-binary people, right? Not every non-binary person or like genderqueer person uses they, them pronouns. People might choose a mixture of pronouns. So like, for example, like, Bobbie Joe, they, she, that's a mix of pronouns. It's more than just one. Or some people, like even cisgender people might choose this as well, might just want no pronouns at all. Like, don't refer to me as a pronoun, just use my name. Like, try to avoid gendering me with your language. And that's a decision that people make as well. Or there's some folks also that choose pronouns that are not she, him, or they. And these are called neopronouns, right? So it can be things like Zer, right? And they function the exact same way that like she, him, or they pronouns would do, right? Just put them in the right like language box. So like he went to the store, like Z went to the store, right? And the only way that you can ever find out what someone feels comfortable with is by asking them, which is why it's important if you're in a new space or you're welcoming people to a space to always ask, how do you feel comfortable being referred to? And it can be as simple as that, right? No more questions, and they tell you what they feel comfortable with. And maybe like if it's something that you're not familiar with, then ask them, oh, so would I use it like this, and give an example like I did with the store. And if they say, yeah, that sounds cool, then that's how you use it. Or if it's not correct, then they'll correct you. And it's just very important to have this constant dialogue because, like I said, language will mean different things to different people. It does not always reflect their gender identity, but oftentimes it is the best way to affirm, people's identities and, the way that they want the world to perceive them. Because pronouns are something that's very public. And when someone makes the active choice to, like, tell you how to refer to them, especially if it's something that, does not fit in a, like cis heteronormative box, it's something that can take a lot of courage for some people, especially when their pronouns relate to their gender identity or like a gender queer identity. So yeah, make sure to respect people, ask them for their pronouns. And when you're in doubt, like, you're in doubt, and that's okay. Keep learning. Make spaces open for people, and people will understand. Even if you're not perfect at pronouns, if you're making an effort, like a genuine effort, we can tell. And that means a lot, you know? If you're just not trying at all because you're scared of messing up, then you just don't care. Like, I'm sorry, but you literally don't care.
Like that centers your feelings of like, I'm insecure and I'm afraid of looking dumb, and not like the other people that you're referring to or trying to reference. And I just wanted to note, I always feel like the response to this kind of conversation is like, God, I don't know why people are such sticklers for like specific language. And it's like, to point out, the language itself is very gendered. Like English, the language of English is a super gendered language. The language of Spanish is a super gendered language that does not have room for like basically non-binary people, and people of other genders outside of binaries. Like, we're not sticklers for language. We're trying to work with the language like restrictions that are in front of us. And unfortunately, these colonizer tongues, like they colonized very well because we literally cannot, we have to make up words. We have to, make these words that people are like, well, that wasn't a real word. It's like, dude, all words are made up. Like, what are you talking about? Like, we have to work within these language barriers, and that's not always perfect. So that's also why language changes like over the years, and terms change over time, because it's like, we're not working with the best set of stuff here, but we're doing our best is kind of how I see it. So yeah, like gendered pronouns are not inherent to language. There's quite a lot of languages that don't have gendered pronouns. So just something to think about.
Yeah, definitely. And it's interesting to be having these conversations because a while back I met one of my friends' friends. So it was the first time meeting and we were just talking. They were telling me that they were going to go on a date in a couple of weeks. And I was like, oh, cool. Like, have you met them before? And right away they turned around and looked at me and they're like, oh, gender fluid. I love that. But in my own case, I was like, oh, like, it's just normal because I don't know your sexuality. I'm barely meeting you. Like, I don't know who you're into, what you're into, who the person or like who you're talking to. So for me, it was normal to just say that. And like the entire conversation, I was kind of like thrown back because I was just like, what did I say something wrong? But it's like, no, because it's like they're used to people being like, oh, and who is she? Because like they represent as a cis male. So it's like, oh, like then that's when I was like, okay, got it. I was like, so it's just they saw me as like, okay, like they're more like fluid and more accepting of others, but it's just kind of been like a normal sense for me and my siblings as well, because I feel like it's something that they get pushed down onto you. It's like, okay, well, you're either a man or a woman, especially growing up in like a Mexican household. It's like, well, today we're going out and you're going to wear a dress. So it's like, and I've always had more like masculine like energy to myself in the way I dress, but like as the way I look like more feminine sometimes. So it was always like, well, no, I don't want to wear a dress. Like I want to wear pants and like tennis shoes. And my parents were always like, no, like, so you're going to wear a dress and stuff. You're going to wear pink and purple. And so me and my sister like started making it work for us where we would wear like more feminine clothes, but at the same time, it was more masculine clothes. So to my parents' eyes, we looked good, like we looked feminine, but we knew when we felt comfortable. So we just started like messing with it. And so like now till this day, like you can go into our closets and we might be wearing like a dress, but at the same time, like where my like siblings are wearing like docs, or like they make it super masculine by throwing on like different other types. So it's like almost like throwing an androgynous feel to it. Because I feel like it's definitely, they give you a form and they're like, okay, check all the boxes that you like fit in. And you're like, well, I don't fit into these boxes. They're like, well, pick them. And you're just like, well, I'm not going to. Because I know it's definitely like, they would ask you like, oh, what's your sexuality? Well, like, what are your pronouns? What is this? It's like, well, I'm just a fluid human. Like, just take it as it is, you know? And I feel like that's how I approach all like every human that I meet. It's just like, okay, like if I don't know them, I do tend to use just they, them pronouns until like I can figure out like, okay, if they're more comfortable with she, her, or he, him, or whatever it is, it's like, okay, then I'll refer to you as that. And if I do forget, like I'll refer back to they, them, because, you know, and if they tell me like, oh, I use she, her, then I'm like, okay, like I got it. And I feel like, especially in the college environment coming into it, I remember having a talk with my advisor and being like, yo, like, it's going to be crazy like coming into the space, because I was a lot younger and I was like, what if I mess up? He was like, well, you know, they're going to know that you're trying. He was like, and I feel like you're going to be able to like switch right away. He was like, because as it is, you already use they, them. And then I went to college, I was like, and it was just like normal, you know? So I feel it definitely opening up the space and having these conversations really, it's really important for a lot of folks. But with that, well, what do you think are some questions that you ask yourself, or just coming into terms of like being non-binary for kids or like other folks who are questioning or trying to find that who they are and just coming about it?
Yeah, I think for me, like I reflected a lot on like kind of like what you just shared, like those experiences, especially being a younger person, and how like trying to remember back to like how I was perceived, for example, like when I went to school the first day. Because like I feel like when you go to school is really when you feel these pressures of like you're supposed to um, fit into a very specific like way of being. And if you fall outside of that, if you are queer, right, because the word queer also applies to just difference essentially, and abnormality. Like if you're abnormal compared to the normal people at school, who are usually like the super like masculine like bullies, like you know you're a target. And I think like thinking back to times when like realizing like, you know, all of my friends were like people who were targets because they didn't fit into these things. And for a long time, like I didn't know I was queer, but I was hanging out with like a whole lot of queer people and a whole lot of people whose genders are they identify differently than they did when they were younger. And really thinking about like, well, what does that mean? Like, you know, that doesn't necessarily mean like I had mentioned earlier, like I was changed or turned, but just like, what does it mean that all of these people who have these identities that are stigmatized, like we're able to find each other in Greenfield, in like our public schools, and um, are able to like come out and be these different people. Like maybe that's me too, because I'm also a part of those groups and I'm feeling differently. Like I don't necessarily, because I didn't have my life figured out and didn't know who I was when I was like in kindergarten. Like there's some people who know that they're queer like from a very young age, and I wasn't really one of those people, especially because like my gender identity and even my sexuality, like they weren't necessarily just like I'm not gay, so all I thought was like, oh, you can only be gay. Like that's the only other option. So for a long time I was like, oh, like, well, I'm not gay, so I must be straight, even though I'm clearly not. Like I'm not, but I'm like, there's no other option for me. That's what happens when you grow up in South County, where there's like no resources. Like I just didn't know like the spectrum. I didn't know that there was so much more to be. So definitely during the pandemic was like re-going over like those scenarios and these experiences that I've had, even experiences of like, I was one of those people who was the tomboy. I absolutely hated the color pink when I was a kid because I had perceived like, well, if you wear pink, you're like dumb because you're a dumb, like feminine woman, and women are like not supposed to, like if you're too feminine, then you're just like a dumb blonde, like legally blonde status. Like that's not who I'm trying to be. I don't want to be perceived that way. And this real like shutdown of like, I look at old like even pictures of myself, like I was so much more masculine as like a young person. And it wasn't until I got like older that I felt more free to like really feel out my femininity and like be this person that I had concealed for a long time. But then even doing that in like my first few years of college, and I was looking back on this in the pandemic, like there was a point too where I was like, but I don't always feel this feminine. Like, I don't always want to wear makeup. I don't always want to look like, you know, a hot baddie. Like, yeah, sometimes that's cool, but like, that's not me all the time either. And having to like reassess again, like, damn, like, well, who am I? who am I trying to portray myself as? Who do I want to be? And that's kind of been like the second half of college, like to now, is like reassessing like who do I want to look like, and who am I is like these really deep questions. And yeah, a lot of reflecting on like childhood experiences and the past, which is not always great, but if you have the space to do it, if you have the support to do it, I think it can really allow you to like look back at moments that maybe you didn't understand when you were younger and really like sift through them and be like, oh, like maybe that's what that was. Like maybe that wasn't just like some weird experience. Like maybe that was like a pretty critical moment for me that is revealing more about like, maybe I have known who I am for longer than I think. And maybe I didn't have the words then to like explain it. I think that's an experience that's come up a lot for me this last year. I don't know, Mariluz, if you have any like maybe reflections or like things that maybe have come up for you in like your journey of finding your own identity as well, if you want to share.
Yeah, I feel like I have a completely different experience because I was one of those people that knew at a young age. Like I just kind of knew. I didn't really think much about it. I was 10 years old, man. I just knew. But something that did happen to me though is that it was very easy to accept like my queerness in terms of like attraction, you know, when I was that young. But it was difficult to accept it in terms of gender. Because even though like in social media and all that, like when I was in middle school, I was on social media, like I would watch YouTube. We often talk about queerness in terms of sexuality. Back then and even now, we don't really talk about it in terms of gender. So even though I felt different and like I knew that gender queerness existed and like I knew that was me, I didn't really have the language to point it down. Or like oftentimes what would happen to me and what happened to me like until I basically accepted my, you know, gender queerness was that I never really felt trans enough. And this is something that a lot of non-binary people go through, or like, yeah, people who don't transition or like don't consider themselves to be like a trans man or a trans woman, aka like, you know, the two gender identities in the binary, is that we can feel this experience or this thought of not being trans enough. And this was really what repressed me from like, you know, living as my trans self, because literally throughout like all of high school, like I'd feel uncomfortable when people referred to me as she, her, like I'd feel uncomfortable being gendered as a woman, but I didn't know what to do about it. I was like, well, like, you know, I don't want to be a trans man, so I guess I'm just not trans, and I don't know, I'll just keep feeling uncomfortable. And I clearly remember the day when I told myself that was going to come to an end. It was actually during a Telpochcali session where we were talking about identities. And like, you know, this activity was like, oh, what identity are you? There were many questions, right? And one of the questions was like asking us to talk about which identity of like a multiple examples of identities that we can hold were we the most aware of on a day-to-day basis. And obviously, since I always thought about my gender, at that point for me, it's like my gender identity. Yes, like I think about this way too much. And I remember just being in that space and being like, yeah, like I'm just gonna accept being non-binary. And from that day, like I accepted being non-binary. So I consider that like being my coming out to myself as you can see, like I said, I don't really believe in coming out, but something this arbitrary was like, you know, accepting myself and like telling myself, oh, I can do this. And I remember this moment so vividly because it was just, you know, a moment of acceptance of like, yes, I can be trans enough, and like non-binary people can consider themselves to be transgender. Like I am transgender. And I can be non-binary. I can be something else that's not like a man or a woman. Um so I guess like what really helped me in that journey was learning more about queerness, learning more about like how people hold identities of queerness, like literally watching videos from queer creators, you know, like seeing posts about queerness on social media, reading them and being like, oh, this is pretty cool. Like, hey, I didn't know this. Because like I said, back then there not a lot of people talked about being genderqueer in terms outside of like trans men or trans women. It's gotten better now in my opinion, just due to like, you know, social media being utilized more to spread information. But we still have that issue in some spaces. But hopefully, you know, we can talk about queerness in a way that it's more encompassing of different identities that are not just limited to, you know, sexuality and like definition of sexuality, because they can really help young kids like me who are just really confused and repress their identity for years.
Also appreciate you, Mariluz, for mentioning like there's this idea that like if you're trans non-binary, like you must transition. Like that must be really important to either like have top surgery or have bottom surgery or some kind of facial surgery. And that's not true for everyone. Some people, like that's what they need, that's what they require. And I think that should be way more supported, like that's healthcare. But for a lot of people too, like speaking for myself, like I don't necessarily have major like transitions such as those that I want to take, and that's not a sign that you are trans or non-binary. Like those things have to do with how you identify, how you see yourself, how you understand yourself. It has nothing to do with like getting a surgery or getting an operation, which I think is sometimes what it's reduced to, at least within as I've seen within our community. Like you can fall under these identities and have no desire to even change how you look like right now, because it's not about how you look. It's not about, you know, like playing something for other people. It's about you. It's about how do I perceive myself? How do I want to present myself? And nobody can tell you like you're not being trans enough, you're not being non-binary enough, you're not being androgynous enough to fall under those identities. Like that's not, we don't need to police each other. That happens to us enough already, you know? So I appreciate you for mentioning that, Mariluz.
Yeah, and to build off of that, we also have to consider that transition is something that is always more than physical. Like, I consider myself to be constantly transitioning. That is because I know that the way that I look at my gender will change over time, and that's okay. You know, I know that I will discover new things about me, and maybe like I might want some like changes to my physical appearance, but just like, you know, to some people the experience of transition is just changing the way that you see yourself, you know, having that transition away from the gender binary, keyword transition, right? um and for some folks, like making that internal reflection physical is the way that, you know, that is affirmed, right? The physical transition versus like the mental transition. But these things are very complicated, and once again, like we have been emphasizing the whole time, it's very individualized, right? There's people who are genderqueer who do not consider themselves to be transgender, and that's fine. You know, maybe the way that they see their gender identity is different, but I am genderqueer. I consider myself to be transgender because I do not identify with my gender assigned at birth, and I consider myself to be constantly transitioning in terms of how I see my gender, in terms of how I present myself, even because personally, there is an aspect of transition to me that, you know, is physically relevant to my identity. And that's what it is for me, but it's different for so many people. I feel like at this point, y'all can tell, like, there's so many places where we can dig deeper on these topics. Like, there's so much to go, but really the key thing to understand is it's different for everyone else. And if you really want to learn what these things mean, like, keep listening to queer people in your life, like, make space for them, listen to queer creators. Like, there's so many videos probably that you can find on these topics, like, you know, donate to them on, you know, Patreon, like, send them a Venmo, thank them for their time. Yeah, it's just something that's, I think it's really beautiful and it's very special. And I could talk about it on and on and on and on, but I hope this is helping.
Yes, it is very much helpful, Mariluz. So thank you. Thank you both for helping us scratch the surface of these topics. And within our conversations, there's been a lot of terminology. I believe we have sex assigned at birth, gender identity, sexuality. Do you think you can break some of those terms down for us?
For a while. But sex assigned at birth, this is referring to like what you could call like the biological aspect of things. Sex assigned at birth is basically assigned at birth by a doctor. That's why it's called sex assigned at birth, because it's a doctor who basically says this, right? Often it's based just on like an individual's genitalia. So like a baby is born, doctor shows up and they're like, I'm going to assign the sex. And then they basically just look at the baby. They look at their genitalia specifically, and from there just say, okay, you're either an M or you're F, right? That's like the little boxes that they mark. However, our medical system is not exempt from like the colonial structures of like white supremacy and patriarchy and cis heteronormativity. So although like the medical system and what we learn in like bio class in high school is like there is only like men and there is only males and there's females and that's it. As I've mentioned with plants, that is not all that there is. Sex is much more complicated than just like having a penis or having a vagina. It's more complicated than the genitalia you have. Our systems of medicine still operate on that gender binary. So doctors are often trained and then restricted by like the medical system to only recognize male and female sex as like the only sexes that exist, right? However, that is not all that exists. There's quite a bit of variation. Humans are very complex. Our genetics are very complex. So even people who have quote unquote normal genitalia are not necessarily like their chromosomes will not necessarily say that they are, you know, XX or XY, because biology is a lot more complicated than how we are taught it is. So a whole other, I guess you could, I don't want to call it a category because sex is also kind of like a spectrum. But there are people who are born with like ambiguous external genitalia, or like there's differences between their external anatomy and their internal anatomy. So they don't like fall within just male or female sex. And these are people who are often, the term that we use is intersex. But unfortunately, as I mentioned, because the American healthcare system is like super relies and works from the binaries of gender and sex, basically a lot of intersex people, like from the moment they're born, are not recognized as being like falling outside of that category. Unfortunately, it's a pretty common practice where any sort of like difference in genitalia that a doctor sees that like, oh, well, that doesn't look quote unquote normal, they will correct it like on scene, basically like performing an operation like on a child, sometimes without parental consent, because there's this idea that like, who would want their child to be this way? This is abnormal, this is a problem, like all the things we hear about queerness essentially. So there's like this really big issue of like intersex people basically trying to be like erased by like different medical institutions. But I feel like it's just it's so clear, like when you really start digging into this, when you go past 9th grade biology class and you really start investigating like how do humans actually work, it's much more complicated than just males, females, and that's it. So that's how I would explain sex assigned at birth. I don't know if I'm missing anything, Mariluz, if you want to add anything. But yeah, that's like a pretty, it feels kind of complicated because again, it is. It's not as simple as just like MF.
Yeah, it's great. So moving on to gender identity. I feel like we've already talked about gender identity, but just to give a more like concrete definition. So gender identity is essentially like how a person defines or recognizes themselves in relation to the gender binary and cis heteronormativity, essentially like the assumption that everyone is either a man or a woman and that everyone is straight. And this is important because there are some people for whom like queerness in terms of sexuality also influences the way that they see their gender. And this is often an experience with like gay men and lesbian women who obviously like due to our society, you know, not being very supportive or thinking that it's other for like a man to love a man and a woman to love a woman, define their gender as something that is different, because obviously like when we combine like the expectations of sexuality and the expectations of gender, then we think about like, oh, a woman should love a man and a man should love a woman, but what happens when a man loves a man and a woman loves a woman? And there's many queer histories as well, and like many queer writings of like genderqueer, lesbian, and gay folks, which I would be happy to go into if there's a question about it, or y'all can also look into in your own free time. It's very interesting. You know, there's just so many factors that can impact our gender identity and the way that we see our gender, and sexuality is just one of them. So under gender identity, we can also break down gender expression. So gender expression is essentially how someone physically presents themselves through, you know, their appearance. So things like voice, clothing, behavior, mannerisms, etc. And oftentimes gender expression can be used by folks to affirm their gender identity. So, you know, a great example of this is, you know, in the discussion of transition, some folks might decide to physically transition because in that way, you know, their physical, you know, presence or what other people will see will better reflect the way that they feel about themselves and how they consider themselves to be, the gender that they consider themselves to be. So gender dysphoria, to break down what gender dysphoria is, gender dysphoria is essentially like psychological distress that occurs from an incongruence between one's sex assigned at birth and one's gender identity. And this distress can be something like, you know, I feel uncomfortable with the shape of my body because I know that everyone will see the shape and think that it's very feminine. They'll think I'm a woman, but I'm actually not a woman. So I feel dysphoric about, you know, the way that my body's shaped. Or dysphoria can also, you know, be about voice, like, oh, people will hear my voice and they'll automatically gender me as a woman, and I don't want to be gendered as a woman, so I feel dysphoric about my voice. And there's so many other things that you could be dysphoric about. Really, it's endless. But also the thing that I want to emphasize is that dysphoria, and especially physical dysphoria, is an experience that is not exclusive to genderqueer people or people that lie outside of the binary. There's people like cisgender people who might like, you know, work on their appearance or change their appearance due to a dysphoria that arises from not feeling masculine or feminine enough. So for example, you know, men that go to the gym to get super buff, right? they might be getting super buff because they don't feel masculine enough and they feel dysphoric about their body. Or like women who decide to get a BBL, right? They might not feel feminine enough with their body, so they go get a BBL, so they feel more feminine, right? And there's so many different experiences of dysphoria that we can have, so many different things that, you know, we can feel dysphoric about, but what we decide to do about that is really up to the individual, right? So I might feel dysphoric about, you know, a certain part of my body, but that doesn't mean that I'm going to modify it just because I feel dysphoric about. And if someone ever expresses to you that they feel dysphoric about something, it would be really insensitive for you to suggest to them ways to change that unless they actively ask you for those suggestions and for those ways to change that. Because dysphoria is something that is very personal and very sensitive. Because oftentimes, like, the things that we're dysphoric about, like, in our minds feel like things that will never be able to be changed, or things that, like, you know, relate to how people gender us. And it, like, at least this for me, then I'll end up like in a loop of like, oh my god, like I'll never be able to change these things, like these small traits, like people will gender me due to them, like I feel super dysphoric, and it's just a mess. So TLDR, gender identity, how people define themselves within like the gender binary, cis heteronormativity, physical expression, how people decide to express themselves, essentially like what you're able to see. And people might choose like different gender expressions based on, you know, the gender identity to affirm that. So essentially, like if they want people to gender them in a certain way, they will change their expression so people will gender them in that certain way so they feel affirmed. Gender dysphoria, this is psychological distress that results from like an incongruence between one's sex assigned at birth and one's gender identity, also related to the way that people perceive you oftentimes, but not necessarily. It can also be like the way that you think other people perceive you, or the way that you even perceive yourself, because obviously we are all in this like cis heteronormative society, so we all understand, like, in a way, you know, what it means to have certain traits and what it means to look a certain way.
Definitely. I feel like it's funny because like sexuality is like at the end here, but like I feel like before, like within like the last few decades, like sexuality was like the main focus of everything, like all of these terms, learning all these things. And now it feels like there's so much more room to have like the conversation about gender identity, because gender identity is so complex, and also sex assigned at birth. But to finish out, because we do have to talk about sexuality because it still is relevant, but it's not the whole pie, obviously. But sexuality essentially has to do, again, with the way you identify how you experience sexual and romantic attraction, because sexual and romantic attraction are actually two different things. You can have a sexual attraction with someone, not have any romantic interest in them, or you can have a lot of romantic interest in someone and not actually have that much sexual attraction in them, and different combinations of those things. But anyway, sexuality is how you experience sexual and romantic attraction, if you do, because not everybody does. Asexual people, aromantic people. And it also has to do with your interest in and your preferences around like sexual and romantic relationships here. For example, it's not just necessarily like I'm, you know, I'm gay, I like men, or I'm, you know, a lesbian and I like women, but it also has to do with like, how many partners are you cool with having at one time? Are you polyamorous? Are you monogamous? Like there's lots of variations in how people build relationships with each other. And sexuality encompasses all of those different variations, which I don't think we necessarily have to go into fully, because I feel like, again, sexuality is what most people are comfortable with. But I did really want to point out, like, it's not just the gender of who you want to be with or the sex of who you want to be with, but it's also like the way that you have that relationship and what that relationship can look like. Because again, it's also complex. Like we're so used to seeing these things in boxes. Are you a male or female? Are you a man or a woman? Are you heterosexual or are you homosexual? And that's very like checklist-y, but queer people whose identities lie outside of these boxes you know, by not making that room, that's how we get people alienated, harassed, discriminated against, incarcerated, or even like killed. Like it's very, this all can seem like, oh, this isn't that important, but it really is very, very, very important. And the stakes are very high, I feel like, for understanding this. Again, this isn't just about having a pride flag. It's so much deeper than that. And even though this might feel like, oh, well, these are just definitions, like, I feel like it's so crucial that we're even having this conversation, because as we've mentioned, like we come, me and Mariluz are people who are coming from spaces where like we didn't even have words. We didn't have words to describe these things, and to really understand them as spectrums and not just like, you know, you're just abnormal, you just don't fit here. But yeah, I feel like that's what I have for these. And the only thing I guess I would want to add lastly is just like, these are also fluid. So just because your identity, your gender identity is one thing at one point in your life, doesn't mean it's going to be the same thing by the end. And just because your sexuality is one thing at one point in your life, doesn't mean it's going to be the same thing by the end. And that's cool. Like, you know, I like Lady Gaga too. Some of us were born this way and that's how we're going to stay, but not everybody, you know, not everybody's like that. And that's cool too. Allow room for the fluidity, you know?
Just thank you for breaking that down and for continuing to just, I remember during the presentation at the beginning, y'all asked, you know, what are our intentions or what are your intentions? And I really just like that exercise. And I know for myself, I put down, you know, learning and unlearning. And I really like how y'all broke that down, the unlearning, right? Because we are born into a space where we're already gendered without even, we put, you know, names to children or however it is, right? And so it's just interesting because a lot of time, you know, we want to be able to break out of those molds and just have people be free and live free lives and live however they wish to live. And like the Zapatistas put it, at least for myself, this conversation fits in with their ideal of a world where many worlds fit, where it's not just one way of living or one way of being. It's being able to find who you are and explore who that is and being respected for it, right? And not bullied or treated unfairly or whatever it might be, right? People, you know, have been killed. And rest in power for all those people that have been killed just for expressing who they are and just for trying to live their truth. And so thank y'all for just kind of bringing this, you know, this is a like we said at the end of the presentation, this is an ongoing conversation. We can't just have one presentation and expect, oh, everyone's on the same page, everyone's on board, right? There's still a lot of questions that come up, or even just like, oh man, like this is uncomfortable, or I don't know enough, or I don't want to make a mistake, I don't want to get called out. And so there's a lot of that, but I do appreciate being able to talk about it. So thank you. Identity. But cool. So yes, thank you. Like I was mentioning, thank you so much. So for this final question before we get to our call to action, I'm gonna be asking about so let me preface it with this. So the question is, in your opinion, how has the view of sexuality changed in post-colonial white supremacist world? And something that I really enjoyed, which I actually want to read the article when I have a chance and can really dig into it. It was an article called Indigenous Sexualities, Resisting Conquest and Translation by Manuela L. I hope I'm P-I-C-Q, Peak, and Josie Ticuna. And so just from browsing from it a little bit, it just, the main kind of thing that I'm getting is that queerness, being LGBTIQ, you know, not having a binary between man and woman, this is actually normal within Indigenous culture. And even listening to other stories about how, like, in Indigenous culture, you know, a man can have long braids and wear jewelry and sit in the circle with mujeres and it not be a big deal. That's just part of what it is, of our cultura, of people that are two-spirited, of people that they want to express themselves in however way they want to without being judged. It's just like a norm, right? And so I want to pose the question. We're going to start with Mariluz, and Bobbie Joe, you can jump in after and add. Again, how has this view changed of, let me bring up the question again, of the view of sexuality changed in a post-colonial white supremacist world. So Mariluz, feel free to take it away.
Yeah, for sure. So you can get super theoretical in this question. I'll try to answer it as easily as I can and try to encompass everything that comes into play. So like you said, Rosaura, there are many cultures throughout the world, even, you know, cultures that are not necessarily in the Americas, that do include, like, you know, or how would I say this? That have a view of gender that does not necessarily reflect a rigid binary. I think that's the right way to say it. Because sometimes it can be incorrect to try to fit other cultures' gender systems within our own, because they do not match all the time. If y'all are catching my flow, right? Try to use individual cultures, like language and experiences, like in their own context, rather than crossing context, especially because ours, like, you know, in a hard to use our own language to talk about other folks' experience and other folks' culture. So when it comes to colonization, and more specifically like colonization in the Americas, which I think I want to narrow down in this context because I've fortunately like been able to do some academic work on this as well. Essentially, like, a big process of colonization is ideological colonization, right? And ideological colonization essentially works in the way in that, you know, everyone in a certain colonial region must think in the way that the colonial agent thinks, right? So for example, this would mean, like, if people from, like, you know, that were coming intending to colonize a certain region think in this certain way, then in order to make sure that everyone else will think in this certain way, they will impose this ideology on them. And this is the case of, like, the colonization of the Americas as it relates to gender and sexuality, right? Obviously, like, even more specific, when we talk about Spanish colonization in the Americas was oftentimes interlinked with the Catholic Church, right? So religion in colonization. That's why we have structures like, you know, the missions in California. That's just a reflection of religious colonization. And obviously, how we have discussed, religion and Catholicism is oftentimes like of ideology or like a type of thought that is not very encompassing of, you know, gender queerness or of sexualities that exist out of the binary. And Catholicism essentially relies on man and woman, like, you know, marriage. They're going to be a single, like, couple, just this cute man and woman. They're going to get married, they're going to have children, they're going to have a good time. So when obviously colonization happened in the Americas, this branch of thought was imposed on a lot of different cultures. And perhaps some of those cultures did not have that same, you know, beliefs, did not have those same beliefs in gender and sexuality, right? Some cultures believed in, like, a different type of gender system that does not necessarily reflect, like, oh, just man and woman and that's it. And some cultures also believed in, like, you know, a system of sexuality that was not necessarily always like, oh, just man and woman, or just like monogamy and that's it. So the processes of ideological colonization, since they require everyone to live in the same way, along with, like, you know, restricting folks' cultural practices, it also meant restricting their gender and sexuality practices. So people being forced to marry, people, like, you know, being forced to like only have, you know, a single partner, people being forced to just be man or woman to fit into these practices, right? And I think that this is where we can bring in an even more complicated critique of all of these systems, which is in regards to, you know, the nuclear family. And I think this is relevant, and a lot of y'all have probably heard about it, but it can be a little complicated to talk through. So when we think about the nuclear family and colonization, we think, oh, a man and a woman, the man will work, the woman will be a caretaker, the woman will educate the kids, and the kid will come out and they will do the same thing over and over again. But this ensures that we have a production of humans to work and to continue the capitalist system. And I think that this is a great critique to bring in when we talk about colonization, because, you know, so far the way that I've talked about colonization is in terms of like ideological domination and religion. But something that's also very important to note is that a lot of the colonial powers in the Americas, or basically all of them, were capitalist, right? Which is the reason why like we have capitalism here now, due to like, you know, the capitalist processes of colonization and like, you know, the colonial powers, right? Literally a lot of the reason why like these people or these Europeans were even interested in like exploring and colonizing was just to make more money. So if we think about it like that, right, you know, colonizers, when they came and they saw their people here and, you know, they decided to engage in these systems of ideological colonization, these systems also benefited the production of a worker class, right? So through ideological colonization, we can subvert people's identities, we can subvert their cultural practices, and by that, we are also forcing them to engage in capitalism and making sure that they will continue existing here, that they will reproduce these systems, they will reproduce these thoughts, even if it's not like, you know, what they originally believed on, or like, you know, what their culture is based on. They will reproduce them to the future generations, they will reproduce them, you know, to their communities, so that we can have a worker class to do the work that we have to do to physically colonize. And a lot of y'all also know this as transgenerational trauma and transgenerational colonization. So it's all interlinked. And I tried to explain this in the most simplest terms that I could, so y'all could see it is, you know, very easy like to understand when you really like have the language, when you have the history for all of this, but it's also very hard because everything is interlinked. But we oftentimes don't talk about it in the context of gender and sexuality. But colonization is a hellhole, and that's all I have to say on that.
I think you did a pretty thorough job, Mariluz, of explaining that. And I feel like I don't have too much to add, but more just like summarize what you said. But I to put it, I guess, in a more like simpler way, essentially like our whole concept of queerness as being like this queer abnormal thing that is new, that is modern, that is not that is not necessarily how it is. And if anything, the thing that is more new is the gender binary. It's cis heteronormativity. Like these are the things that have been imposed on us, that we've been, as Mariluz was just saying, conditioned to believe that this is our reality. This is how things work. Men and women go together, they make babies. That's how things are supposed to go. Men are supposed to act a certain way. Women are supposed to act a certain way. They're supposed to look a certain way. And that's human nature. And that's not human nature, that's white supremacy, essentially, because we have all of these, and it's even to say it too, like, it's not even just like indigenous people in the past it's like indigenous people now, because there's still indigenous people now, there's still culture now, there's still people who have survived all of that and are still here today, who can still share their knowledge with their future generations. But we bring up the past to just reference, like, again, like this isn't new. And maybe like the specific terms LGBTQ, even queerness, like these are new terms that have been developed to like make sense of where we're at now. But even then, like we can't use those terms, I think, to fully understand the past, like what indigenous people in the past, like how they viewed sexuality, how they viewed gender, because unfortunately, like that's not, like we really can't know. They had a completely different like way of looking at the world. As we've mentioned, we're living in the matrix. Like they weren't living in the matrix. So we can't ever fully like, I think, apply like these terms today to those people back then, or even the people that exist today. Like two-spirit, for example, is often used interchangeably with queerness, but two-spirit, from what I have learned from two-spirit people, has very like specific teachings behind it, a very specific origin. And it's honestly, I don't like, from what I've heard, it can't be just equated with just queerness, because again, like it's something that is from a time when like there wasn't an idea of just queerness. Like queerness didn't have to exist because there wasn't necessarily like a system of white supremacy creating like, you know, this oppressive state where people are marginalized and made abnormal. So I think that's just something to point out, but it's still, I think, important to reference, like, again, like this isn't new. This isn't because of Gen Z. Like this isn't just like because of TikTok or some like modern invention, because I feel like that's how some people talk about it. Like we've been existing. People have been existing and have not fallen into these categories and have different ways of understanding gender identity and sexuality. That is normal. That is natural. To have diversity is natural, not to be the same over and over and over again for the sake of, as Mariluz mentioned, capitalism, because that's what it's for. If you have a bunch of people who feel really oppressed, like, and don't explore themselves and are always just surviving, like, you know, it breeds all of these issues that we see in our communities. And that's a part of why queer liberation is a part of the larger struggle for liberation. Because again, as Mariluz mentioned, like it's all interconnected. And when people say like, oh, that has nothing to do with me because I'm not queer, like, yes, it does. We're all in this. It's all like, you live in this world, it has to do with you. But I think you did a really good job, Mariluz, of explaining the ways that sexuality is different now, and it's not, our understanding of it can change and transform. We can't ever go back to like whatever existed previously, unfortunately, because we don't know, but we can try to build something better to move forward. I think that's the lesson here, is how do we resist and create new systems that aren't oppressive, that aren't so binary. How do we decolonize? Like that's ultimately the question, I think. And I don't know the full answer, but a part of it is reflecting and figuring out like who you are outside of all the colonized conditioning that you have. Like I feel like that's my call to action, because like there isn't going to be one action. Like you should always be trying to figure out actions, but if there is one thing you can do, it's, I think, reflecting on your own identity, reflecting how do you perpetuate oppression? How have you perpetuated oppression against people who were queer? Like I know even as a queer person, like I've been homophobic in the past, like I've hella internalized that before. Reflecting on that, but then also reflecting on like your own personal identity and who are you underneath all of that, and who could you be if you allowed yourself the room and the freedom and the space to be, essentially. But yeah, I mean, also give queer people money. That's always a cool thing. But yeah, other than that, be in community with queer people. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. Don't be afraid to be uncomfortable. If you're uncomfortable, you're growing. And yeah, I think, Mariluz, do you have anything, a call to action that you want to share?
Same thing. Keep learning. Listen to queer people. Don't be afraid. Please don't be afraid. Like, we understand, especially if you're coming from a background where, the gender binary, where like heteronormativity is all that you've ever known. Like, it can be very overwhelming and you can feel like you're going to make mistakes, and it's okay to make mistakes as long as you're willing to learn from those mistakes and you're willing to recognize those mistakes when they happen. Also, consume more queer media, support small queer creators, not like this big, like, freaking corporate BS. Like, don't watch those weird queer shows on Netflix. Like, watch the ones made by small creators on YouTube,
You don't have to keep watching Ellen. Like, we're good. Ellen does not represent the queer community.
Don't do that.
Support the queer people around you, the ones that don't have like big bucks and like a whole TV show. Just because like one of the white gays like has something does not mean the rest of us do. So always like fighting and remembering that seeing a pride flag does not mean that your community is safe for queer people. There's always work to be done. We should always be pushing beyond just like representation and recognition. That's not enough. We need like actual resources. We need actual funding. We need to defund the police. We need to fund community resources, community services. Those are all queer issues, even though they're not often painted that way. Be doing that work, because that's a part, again, the larger liberation for all of us, like queer liberation is in that. So making sure that like what you're supporting is also supporting queer liberation, because if it's not, then it's not supporting liberation. You're supporting something else. At least that's like my rule book for like what I'm supporting. Like, is this supporting everybody? Okay, if it's not, then I shouldn't be here.
Yeehaw. Well, thank y'all so much. Caitlin, Desiree, feel free to jump in if there's any final reflections.
I just want to say thank you. It definitely helps many folks just even start the conversation to get their mind flowing. And I feel like y'all definitely gave a lot of answers to even people who just had like a little idea of it. So appreciate your guys' time. Definitely learned a lot myself. I know I've been having these conversations as well, but definitely learned a lot.
Yes, I'd say likewise. I learned a lot here today. Like I had mentioned before, more than the presentation that y'all had for us, for the staff. So I guess this is a continuation of that conversation. I just really appreciate y'all's time and knowledge on this topic that we discussed here today. So just appreciate y'all.
All right, everybody. Gracias, Mariluz, Bobbie Jo. May you have a blessed day, and thank you so much for your time, energy, effort, and saludos to everybody. We're recording this on a Friday afternoon, so please go out and just take care of yourself. We need to look forward to those little parties. Bobbie Jo and I had started talking about doing a party at the Greenfield Skate Park, so that would be really cool to do during the summer. Hit up the Greenfield Skate Park, stay in touch with MILPA to learn about that opportunity to hang out with folks, skate, and just be in community together. So, all right, everybody, thank you. Have a beautiful Friday.
Bye, y'all. Thanks for having us. Don't forget to celebrate Juneteenth tomorrow.
Yes, Juneteenth.
Yeah. Love y'all. Thank you for having us.